And we're back. This is the part 2 to me ranking and reviewing poetry books that I read this summer. If you haven't seen part 1 already, make sure to check that out. That's where I rank and do an in-depth review for the first 5 books on this list. To be honest, I definitely was planning on filming the second part literally the day after I filmed part 1. And then I got hit with the bubonic plague. Seriously, this might have been like the worst cold I've ever had. Like, it felt like it was medieval times and I was dying. But we're back now. We're back and we have a chocolate banana oat milk smoothie. And we're gonna pick up where we left off, which unfortunately is one of my more controversial takes that you're gonna see during this tier list video. So let me just take a sip and brace myself for that. So I've had my eye on this book, Deaf Republic by Ilya Kaminsky, for a couple years now, and I finally got around to buying it. It's kind of thought of as a novel in verse. It takes place in this fictional town of Vysenka, and it follows a narrative, but through poetry. And I mean, just look how awesome this summary sounds. Quote, Deaf Republic propels the reader forward through a harrowing story in 2 acts that opens with the shooting of a deaf boy in a public square by occupying soldiers. In protest, the townspeople go deaf, organizing their dissent through puppetry and sign language. A work of profound imagination from The New Yorker, Deaf Republic is a cutting-edge, sweeping drama, Washington Post, a book of small graces, of resistance, of inordinate, unconditional humanity. A visit to this republic will not leave the reader unchanged. I got goosebumps reading the summary again, even though I've already seen it. It sounds so imaginative, so unique, like puppetry and sign language as a form of protest. I was set. Not only did I think that the summary sounded super interesting when I initially heard it, but I also noticed that Kaminsky received the same National Poetry Award as I did when he was an undergrad. So I was like, okay, twinning. Now I definitely have to buy the book. I also studied ASL, American Sign Language, in college, so I already had an interest in that as well. This book has received so much praise from really big names such as the New York Times or the LA Review of Books. It was all coming together, guys. It was all coming together. This book and I were fated to click, you know? And unfortunately, I couldn't really get into it. I know. I don't know what's wrong with me. Honestly. The book has a narrative structure, as I mentioned, that takes the form of 2 different acts, so kind of formatted like a play. And there are recurring characters that you encounter throughout these poems that live in this war-torn town. For me, I think the main aspect of this book that prevented me from truly connecting with it is that it felt so short for the amount of characters and plot and setting that it was trying to establish. There was so much murder and death of these characters, like one after the other. And at times it felt like that's all these pages really had room for, rather than putting the time into establishing the characters so that we feel weight when they are murdered or pass away. I also love hybrid literature, but the way this specific work combined narrative beats with poetry kind of felt like a weird in-between space for me. It made me not really able to appreciate either form or genre, rather. That said, the sheer amount of reviewers and poets who are way more successful than I am, who have read this collection and really connected with it and given it wonderful reviews, tells me that there is undoubtedly an audience for this book. I guess the audience just wasn't me. So I don't want anyone to think that you will definitely have the same gripes with it as I did. That was just my personal experience with it. So as you might have guessed, I'm going to have to put this in the lowest tier for me, as much as that saddens me. Phew, the hard part is over. I can breathe again. So this is a really important announcement for subscribers. If you did hear this in the last video, because I cover it there, feel free to skip over me. But if you haven't heard this announcement yet, please don't skip this. Basically, if you want to be on that priority list that I have been talking about, where you will be prioritized for different projects and participation in videos moving forward, make sure that you either have your sub settings on public so I can see that you're subscribed, or make sure that you leave a comment down below just letting me know that you're subbed and I can put you on the list as well. I'm closing the list today. I mean, I will check the comments probably a few days after as well, but I am looking to finalize that list pretty soon, so just a heads up there. Not super confident on how to pronounce this title. It's technically a fusion between Cantonese and English. This one grew on me the more that I read it. The whole collection ultimately centers around this idea of translation and the many forms that it can take. The title is, I guess, what you could call a mistranslation or a made-up translation that takes these Cantonese words meaning pretty woman and adds the English superlative est to the end of them. The deeper I got into the book, the more this title choice clicked for me, because the speaker is in this constant power struggle with translation. Besides just doing the obvious thing and including both English and Cantonese in her verse, Choi also introduces so many unexpected ways that translation can appear in our everyday lives. Translation takes the form of genetic back pain passed down from the speaker's grandmother, names and labels for different people and locations, a cultural tattoo on a tourist, a hand-me-down dress. We see different translations, quote unquote, of the speaker's hair, of their perception of Western beauty standards, and of the way that they love. Everything, every image seems to be a never-ending iteration of itself. It's similar to ancestry and identity in that way. In this very experimental poem, Choi writes different versions of this voicemail from her grandma, and each version is translated slightly differently based on who the speaker is consulting for the translation. Now, put that who in major quotation marks, because this could include anything from a lover to inanimate objects, such as tiger balm spread on a bruise. The way it frames objects as things that can both be translated and be active participants in translating us is really odd and interesting to me. It definitely leans more into the abstract, but not all of the poems, or even most of the poems, are this experimental. There's still more narrative grounding poems that tell more of a story or give you insight into childhood memories related to translation that give you a breather from the more experimental moments. I have a feeling that the more I read this will probably eventually end up in the best of the best here. For now, I'm going to put it here, but definitely a fascinating read that I think I'll understand more when I return to it. So next is Cortege by Carl Phillips, who I mentioned in my part 1 video. I'd be surprised if someone studying poetry isn't at some point recommended a Carl Phillips book, whether that be his poetry collections or his essays on the craft of poetry. So regardless of what my ranking ends up being for this book, I think it's wise to check out his work, if for no other reason than to have a firmer grasp on what the current poetry landscape looks like today. Now into the review. What I simultaneously find very interesting and kind of overwhelming about this collection is that he ambitiously tackles a lot of these really big, heavy themes like love and grief and death, power, desire, yada yada. At times it felt like a delectable smorgasbord of poetry, and others it felt like whiplash. Now, I love me some bewildering, odd, and straight up confusing language in my poetry, but this felt like the poems were teetering on the line, oftentimes between the type of bewilderment that I find intriguing and the type that makes me want to pull my hair out. There were so many striking language choices and beautiful imagery in this collection. At the same time, the frustration for me comes with poems that seem to have rearranged their sentence structure, poems that are so syntactically subversive that it's hard to find a grammatical logic through which to even read the poem. And I'm not talking about poems where it's supposed to be kind of just like a list of images. I'm talking about poems that do have grammar, just not a grammar that I'm familiar with. Some of these poems just felt like I was outside knocking at the door, desperately waiting to be let in, and Phillips was just like, no bitch, what's the password? Like, you can't understand me that easily. It also didn't help that the opening poem was one of the most intense examples of this, so the very first impression I had of the book was like, oh, we might need to pop a few Excedrin for this one. Just listen to how puzzling the grammar reads in this poem. And again, I'm not against puzzling syntax, but for me, sometimes it just like disrupted the flow of the poem. The first poem is titled The Compass, and it reads, quote, a star, dog, with torch in its mouth, a finger ring but no finger, broken cup. What is lonely? The single breast the beehive resembles, a pair of breasts. On a dish. What else? Comes in pairs, tongs, forceps, a key crossing a key, the cross but recumbent or knocked over, what is called the cross, saltire, T, turned on its side, X, that one and, what stands for. And I'm just reading this and I'm feeling like that author dude that I was kind of criticizing in my first video.
What the hell are they talking about, right?
The only difference is I'm not going to say that it's bad poetry or that it objectively doesn't make sense just because I have trouble grasping it. At the end of the day, this book did not give me headaches, which is a win for me. So I'm going to put it in neutral. And Carl Phillips, you know, obviously, still an icon. Next is Soft Science by Franny Choi. Now, this is an example where I feel like in the majority of poems, the meaning plays hard to get in a way that is flirtatious and fun instead of debilitating. This collection follows a protagonist of certainly an unusual sort. They're a cyborg. Yeah, you heard me correctly. A cyborg, a half-clanker. Now, this might sound like a silly premise on the surface, but Choi cleverly uses the idea of something that is not fully human and is part machine as a way of commenting on how society tells us to behave, operate, and perform our humanity. Specifically, this book delves into how we perform our sexuality, we perform our race and gender, the whole kit and caboodle. One poetic form that comes back regularly throughout is poetry in the form of a Turing test. A Turing test is a series of questions designed to determine whether a machine or computer can pass as human intelligence. Several poems in Soft Science take on this Q&A formatting to expand on what the part human, part machine hybridity of the cyborg represents more metaphorically. That was a long sentence. Now, the poems in this collection that I found to be the most strange, fascinating, and deeply f***ed up were the ones that seemed to hint at sex and submission as a type of performance and kind of mechanical obedience. Some poems make these really uncomfortable, grotesque comparisons between the protagonist's femininity and the function of a sex doll. Essentially, it was giving Ex Machina in poetry collection form, and I was at the edge of my seat. I love how unique this idea is for a poetry collection and as kind of an extended allegory. I love that it feels cohesive but not boxed in and repetitive. So I'm going to put Soft Science as the second best of the best poetry book next to Yellow Rain. The Cyborg Devoured and The Cyborg Left No Crumbs. Next is E.B. Shockley's The New Black. While this one isn't centered around historical events, Shockley does have a lot of time play in her poems. A similar type of time play that is going on in The Afflicted Girls that I discussed in the part 1 of this video. She interweaves different historical time periods and has the speaker interact with historical figures. She'll create dialogue, crafting a space for an otherwise impossible conversation to occur about America's identity. I don't know why I don't have much to say about this one. Like, I don't have any major complaints about it. It just felt like I read the poems and then they were out of my mind forever. They didn't have a lot of staying power for me. But I think it's possibly because of the power imbalance that Shockley creates in these interactions. On the one hand, you have these really big, widely known historical figures, and I never felt like I really knew who the narrator was, who's speaking to them, and why should I care about this speaker. This disconnect felt even more prominent in poems where the historical figures were absent and it simply just took on the POV of this recurring narrator. My connection to the speaker was not strong enough to get me to care about those poems, I think. And I think this kind of showed through how few notes I took on this book. Usually when I take notes on a poetry collection, we're talking pages. We're talking Rachel's long-winded letter to Ross in Friends.
18 pages. Front and back!
But in this case, there was literally, I think, like a few bullet points that I took. Hopefully my MFA advisor is not watching this because that's probably bad practice. But so there's not much else to say for me. I'd probably put this below Cortege, but still in like the meh neutral category. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on these poetry books, and I'd love to hear about poetry books that you all read this summer and what you thought of them. Always looking for new recommendations.